of you hopefully have heard of our name by now. So our charity is Mental Health Innovations, and we run the Shout 85258 service. The service, just to talk you through how it works very, very briefly. We're still the UK's only text messaging service. So we run purely as a mental health crisis service for anyone at any time. So we run 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And anyone can text the service to 85258, and they will be connected to one of our trained Shout volunteers or clinicians. The aim is within 5 minutes of their initial text message. If we can just go on to the next slide. So a few unique points, aside from it being 24/7, we say we're free, silent, confidential and off bill. So by that, we mean that with all of the UK major networks, to make sure that it is free of charge for anyone to text. So irrelevant of what network you're on, what type of phone contract you hold, it will be free to text to 85258. Silent, it's because of being text message, it means that we can have a text conversation with anyone, irrelevant of what type of environment they're on. So I am a trained volunteer, and I know I've had conversations where children have been their parents' car and been anxious and worried about something, but can have that silent conversation with us without anyone knowing. I've also had a conversation with an individual that has been in an open plan office, and they haven't therefore had to go and find a quiet corner or a meeting room to go and utilise to have this conversation. They can continue to sit at their desk and have that conversation with one of our volunteers to help get them through that sort of that worry and that anxiousness point. Confidential in that we don't hold any personal identifiable data. So we will always have a conversation with someone, but we won't hold any specific data around that individual. And off bill, we get this question a lot by children and young people where maybe their parent or guardian holds their phone contract. But if they utilise the service, it will never show up on an itemized phone bill. So it adds to that confidential status and that anonymous a lot of children and young people, as I say, like to have. Like I mentioned earlier, we have over 2,600 trained volunteers now. That's both in the UK, and we have a trained volunteer cohort and clinical cohort over in New Zealand as well. So although they're still employed by Mental Health Innovations, it means that they can help us manage the service overnight, where we often see some peak periods, because for them, it's their daylight working hours. So helps us manage that 24-hour period. If we just go on to the next slide. So for those, again, that haven't seen it, this is how it looks on a phone. So for most people, they will text Shout to 85258. For Kent, because of having the partnership and the bespoke keyword, it will be text Kent to 85258. And it will look exactly as it does on the screen there. So someone will send Kent to 85258 and they will receive those 4 automated. That's mainly just to show the texter that they're being connected to a service, but it also talks about the terms and conditions, so about it being free of charge and confidential, and it has that option of texting stop at any time. That's there as a kind of safeguarding barrier for individuals where they may not feel they're in the right environment or headspace to carry on the conversation, and they can text stop, and the volunteer or clinician that they're speaking to won't be able to send any more texts through. We see ourselves as a crisis service, so anyone when they are at a point of crisis. And we know that can be subjective. So we have text conversations from anxiousness, depression. We've had an increase, as you would expect, of loneliness, grief, isolation over the last couple of years, through to self-harm and suicidal thoughts. So we really sort of span the spectrum. And we say that we want to be there to take someone from that point of crisis of calm by the end of that text conversation. On average, the text conversations can last around 40 minutes to an hour. It really does vary. I've had some conversations that only last sort of 15, 20 minutes where someone just needs to have a rant, get some things off their chest, and at that point they feel better and they know their next steps. But it can last up to 2 hours, where you might have an individual that is having suicidal thoughts for the first time and doesn't quite know how to understand their feelings. Conversations can take a little bit longer. Just on the next slide. So as you'll see from some of the stats, we have had a 95% increase in our conversations over a year. The conversations in January 2020 were around 23,000 in 1 month. And then as you can see in January 2021, there were just over 45,000. So we've seen a huge increase during the pandemic as more and more people have needed us. And as the service has started to get out there and the word has got out there a little bit further. Just on the next slide again, please. So we ask some questions of the texters when they finish the text conversation to ask them if they found the conversation useful, and quite an interesting stat that we found of texters who mention the word suicide and have a text topic of the word suicide, 83% of them found the conversation useful. And of all of our texters, 70% felt more calm at the end of their conversation. So hopefully those stats start to show that the text conversation and the way of doing that and the mode of doing that is useful for those individuals that may find texting a little bit easier than face-to-face conversation or even telephone conversation. We do look at the common issues and start to look at trend analysis of those texting in. At the moment, depression, our highest text conversations at around sort of 33% of texters for each one. Suicide has increased over the last year as the pandemic hit and as more people were being stuck at home, losing jobs, feeling more isolated. So we have seen an increase, and we'll continue to look at the stats to look at the mental health trends as life hopefully continues to get back to normal for us all. Just on the next slide. Something else that we ask our texters at the end of the conversation is if they have anything that they would like to relay back to the individual that they've been having the text conversation with, so the clinical staff and volunteers. And we get a huge amount of individuals put in some feedback like the ones you see on the screen there, which often just shows some of the emotive side to all of the data and numbers and stats that we can produce. But actually it's these quotes that really bring to life how useful the service is, how thankful we are to our volunteers to be able to continue to take as many conversations as we can, to get this type of feedback to show that the service is useful, and hopefully as the word is getting out there and more people have the number to be able to use the service as and when they need to.